Welcome to Kesher 100. Center stage. Forgive my back, I'll be momentarily. Welcome to Kesher 100, our centennial celebration. This being the second event in what is really a marquee series that a broad cast of volunteers has worked so hard to bring us. To learn more about the centennial events or to volunteer your services at a future event, go to kesher.org/centennial, email centennial@kesher.org, or friend us at facebook.com/kesherisrael. All audio and video from these events will also be available at kesher.org, so please share with your friends who are unable to join us tonight. The Kesher 100 events will be kicked off by Centennial Ambassadors, a chance for the shriveled veterans and ghosts of Kesher past to have a chance to regale you with Kesher lore. I guess I'm the first of those cranky altacockers. So for my contribution, I considered doing story time about bringing the Secret Service bomb dogs through the shul each Shabbos during Joe's vice presidential run, having Herman Woke schmooze with college kids from GW and Georgetown, or calling up Wolf Blitzer for an aliyah. But for all of the delightful, important people that we've run into over the years, I'd like to talk just for a moment about the regular people. Most people reach Kesher at an inflection point in their lives, a moment during what sociologists sometimes call the Odyssey years, a time when they, but really we, are making decisions that range far beyond these four peeling green walls, and quickly become the parameters that define the contours of their Jewish lives. The Kesher community provides the safe, independent, intellectual, dynamic space that allows so many people, myself included, to shed as much of the cocoon of calcified cultural constraints as they wish and metamorphose as they please at their pace into the Jews that they were meant to be. Witnessing that process take place for hundreds of people and humbly influencing that process for scores of individuals has been the part of our time at Kesher that has most influenced me and my family, and is the part that I will carry forward into the rest of my life. With that, I'll turn it over to the Rabbi for official introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you for doing us the first of the 40 remembrances. Sorry it's going to be remembrances, but you can come back. We're waiting for you. Our subject tonight is innovation in halakha, which allows us to move past the introduction that we provided last month into really the nitty-gritty of some of the issues that are going on in the Orthodox community, and that Kesher, as a modern Orthodox synagogue, has to face in its future, moving forward. Innovation in halakha, that's our subject. I would submit before a panel of three very distinguished people whose historical sensitivity is frankly far more significant than mine, but I would submit to you that the formulation is itself a historical innovation. That if you go back before 200, 300 years ago, before the issue of reform and reformers, you have people who suggest new ideas, certainly, but the idea of innovation in halakha coming with this taint or this sense of, well, are you doing something that is automatically suspect? Are you part of the whole sort of reform kind of attitude is really something new, something that we have to sort of confront now, at this point in time, in ways that we didn't have to do before. Because of this series and because of this evening, I've been rereading Jacob Katz's work on the schism in 19th century Europe between the Orthodox and the Reform. And one of the earliest cases that he cites is a very interesting one, and it's fairly instructive for our subject tonight. Rabbi is appointed, he describes a very erudite rabbi, knows all the sources. And he decides that halachically, you do not have to lane with Trump. You can do a dramatic reading of the Bible. I think everybody up here would agree that halachically, you are Yosef, you fulfill your obligation without the Trump. I suspect that the reason this fellow did this was part of the agenda that we had among some reformers to try to make the synagogue look a little bit more like the church, because it now is a dramatic reading of the Bible rather than a Kriyas HaTorah, rather than a reading of the Torah. And he was vilified and he was attacked as being a reformer and a traditionalist and all the rest. But technically speaking, I don't know that there was a violation of halakha in what he did. Eliminated. Is that necessarily wrong? Was that an innovation that's problematic? And I'm not asking the question to answer specifically about that one. It's not an issue today. But there are so many models of the similar kind of thing that goes on today. The challenge of innovation is very real, and living in an era where the scent of raises the question in respect of, have you gone beyond? It's very different than it was. And certainly there were terrible debates, and people would write things like, you can read in the right of lines like, the comments on the Rambam, you forgot all this Torah movement. But forgetting all your Torah and becoming an ignoramus is not quite the same thing as becoming a heretic and a reformer and somebody who's going past the line. How do we define that? Where do we get there? How does that happen? I'll give you another example from my own work, from something that I just published. The Rambam, when he writes about Hilchos Tefillah, the laws of prayer in the 12th century, has never heard of Kaddish Yasser. There is no such thing as a mourner's Kaddish. It doesn't exist. It doesn't know about mourners saying it. It doesn't know about mourners influencing the souls of dead people. And roughly the same time, in Europe, post-Crusader Europe, we're beginning to get Kaddish as a memorial prayer, and in fact, Kaddish is a prayer that does influence the dead and makes a difference. In fact, in earlier Ashkenazi sources, the idea of saying Kaddish as a prayer for the dead was rejected. It was something that was not accepted, it was something that was not allowed. At funerals, for example, they would either turn their back on the person who had died, or actually leave the cemetery, because Kaddish should not have anything to do with death. It's just simply said after the learning of Torah that is there as part of the eulogy, or as part of the Tziduk Hadim, as part of some of the prayers that you say. Yet today, most people think it is. And in fact, I pray for the dead. In fact, it has spawned dozens and dozens of halachot, down to the Moshe Halbertal, who suggests now that for the average person, since a child cannot say Kaddish for the full 12 months, but rather for our custom, they short 11 months, we should hire someone for the last 12 months, to get that full impact of Kaddish in terms of however we're impacting the soul. I suspect if somebody innovated that today, they'd be accused of being part of Madonna and the Kabbalah sect. Right? But that was okay way back when. So you could make those kind of innovations, apparently. Those are the kinds of things that I hope we're going to look at. Again, not specifically, but generally in terms of that. Let me cite one more source and then I'll posit my question more formally. The Sam Sofer is famous for having opposed innovation. Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. So watch it. It's one of my favorite phrases to say, something new is prohibited from the Torah. Except if you search the Sam Sofer in his writings, you will find that in many cases he did this as an anti-reform statement. But there's one very famous case in which he did it as an anti-chumrah statement, as an anti-stringency statement. Generally was against liberalism, and the case was actually quite interesting because it was about Chadash and Yasha. Chadash and Yasha is a halacha. It has to do with the question of eating new grain from the new year before you pass the 16th of Nisan. If you go to certain places in Brooklyn, the big signs and restaurant windows about Chadash and Yasha. This is spread to Hashgachas and all the rest. He said about the idea of introducing a concern about Chadash and Yasha, Chadash Asur Min HaTorah. This whole idea of worrying about Chadash and Yasha is not allowed. You shouldn't be able to do this. So this new stringency is absolutely wrong, in the words of Sam Sofer, which leads me to my questions in my last 2 minutes. So the question is, what is and isn't legitimate innovation in Jewish law? And is there only halacha? Is there sociology? When does sociology play a role? When is Lamigdal Milsa? When is it that we're sort of drawing the line because we're afraid of the slippery slope? When does that enter into it? How does that enter into it? Is it only wrong if it's a leniency, or is it also wrong if it's a stringency? I'm limited in the time, but I can tell you some remarkable stories of stringency in conversion, which I have something to do with, that are nowhere in Shulchan Aruch or anywhere else, but because they're stringent, people will stand up and salute them, although I think they are extremely problematic. Is it only wrong if it looks like it's modern Orthodox, or is it also wrong if it comes out of Haredi? Is it only wrong if it sounds and looks modern, or is it also wrong if it sounds like it's bringing us back to some image that we have in Europe? Those are the questions I think that we struggle with here in very, very real ways. I'm pleased and honored that we have this panel, and I'm pleased and honored that they get to answer these questions and not me, as I had to do last time. So, I will introduce our speakers. We are going to do this in alphabetical order. The problem is, every one of their resumes would exceed my time limit, so I'm going to cut this down to sort of bare bones. There's far more that exists here than what I'm going to read. Rabbi Dr. David Berger, a very good friend of mine, is now the head of Judaic Studies and the Dean of Rebel at Michigan University. He has been a frequent visitor here. He has spoken here formally as a guest, and we've imposed on him a couple of times on Shabbat when he visited here. It's really my pleasure to have him here. He is the author of, among other things, The Rebbe, the Messiah, and the Scandal of Orthodoxy, the difference in which I'm actually mentioned, and the Jewish-Christian debate in the High Middle Ages, where I'm not mentioned, but we're going to have David Berger. Our next speaker is Moshe Halbertal. who is Gruss Professor of Law at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, published many, many things, including Between Torah and Wisdom, Menachem Hamidiri, and the Maimonidean Halachas and Provence, and people of the book, Canon, Meaning, and Authority. And just to set us off on the right tone for our debate and discussion, we are trying to come up with a volume that will come out of the centennial year, and part of that volume will, with respect, disagree with what you wrote in the book, but we'll talk about that. I want to have a discussion about that with you. And the last is David Novak, who also has a connection to our congregation. He was here, you were a Wilson Scholar, right? You were here for years, is that right? 1993, sort of over here. It was a great pleasure to have him. He's got, frankly, the longest resume of all of them. I will just start with no more iron than you. David Novak holds the J. Richard and Dorothy Schiff Chair of Jewish Studies as Professor of the Study of Religion and Professor of Philosophy at the University of Toronto. He has published, I think, 13 books and many, many other things. And Dr. Novak is a good friend, and it's a pleasure to invite him back as well. So we will go alphabetically for no other reason that we couldn't figure out any other way to do it. So I'll start with Dr. Berger.
I'm glad that you asked questions that can easily be answered within the 7-minute time that we have been given. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Also, you've set the question, large question, before us, so I can really sort of start in the middle of things the way the ancient Greeks did. To a large degree, I think that the debate about halachic flexibility and innovation is carried out on both sides by recourse to straw men, at least at the extremes. On the one hand, a legal system whose practitioners have sincerely believed in its divine origin cannot reasonably be expected to have treated it as potters treat their clay. That is, completely undisciplined flexibility is implausible on its face. On the other hand, no legal system could have remained viable from the period of the Talmuds to the contemporary age had it not responded to human needs and even ideological transformations in ways that look beyond the straightforward meaning of its inherited texts, which is really the way I see this issue. How did Jews deal with the straightforward meaning of classic legal texts when certain transformations made their application problematic? The significant variables determining halachic reevaluation include, among others, and it is among others, the seriousness of the need, ideological convictions, humanitarian concerns, the susceptibility of the text to reasonable reinterpretation, the severity of the prohibition in question, popular instincts regarding that prohibition, and the attitude of the decisor and his community to the likelihood that popular practice may be in error. That's a daunting list. To talk about every one of these things in 1 minute, I would use up my 7 minutes. And so let me give you a few examples, salient examples, I think, salient either because of their importance or because they have been subjected to a scholarly study, which I cannot summarize for you in these 7 minutes. Maybe we can elaborate later. Economic need. One of the most studied issues in pre-modern times on this level was the prohibition against doing business with non-Jews who in Talmudic times were taken to be idolaters on their holidays, lest they go thank their God. It was almost impossible for medieval Jews in Christian countries to refrain from doing business with Christians on Christian holidays, which included Sunday. And there were more Christian holidays evident in the Middle Ages on the street than there are days, I don't know what the situation is in Washington, but then there are days in which New York City suspends all to the side of the street parking on Christian holidays. And there were explanations provided of why these laws can be suspended in medieval Europe. We already heard an example about the eating of grain that appears to be biblically prohibited, but it would have been very difficult for Jews to eat in medieval Christian Europe if this prohibition had been literally applied, and it wasn't. We can't discuss here the arguments. The selling of chametz is an example in the same category. undergo some sort of formal sale so that people can continue to work the land. This is a halakhic innovation of sorts, but at least by the middle of the 20th century, and a little earlier, it depended not only on halakhic argument, but on one's ideological position regarding the importance of the Zionist settlement of Israel, so that the halakhic position of the decisor varied with his attitudes towards Zionism. And that is what I call a competing religious value that causes the rethinking of the straightforward understanding of a text. Technological changes in modern times have created challenges which have to a significant degree been met. Not fully, certainly, but there are a variety of decisions that have been issued that make it possible for Jews to live more comfortably in a technological world. And I read an article some years ago in a Haredi halakhic journal as to what we can do in a world that will increasingly cause us to turn lights on and off on the Sabbath wherever we go. Then there are humanitarian concerns. There is the issue of marriageability. Can Karaites, whose divorces are invalid, presumably, and whose marriages maybe were valid, marry Rabbinite Jews? Could Marranos marry? Well, that's more complicated. There were issues having to do with Marrano levirate marriage when a brother who was a Marrano died, let's say, in Lisbon, and then his brother, who was a Marrano, returned to Judaism, was living in North Africa, died, and there was a childless marriage. And the question is, could the wife remarry, given the fact that that brother presumably has to give her a release? There was the issue of the legitimacy of the offspring of the second marriage of a Reformed Jewish woman, whose original divorce was presumably invalid. In all three cases, the strategy for permitting the marriage was invalidating the original marriage, which is a very interesting and complicated matter, and really leads us to another point, I think, and that is the reception of such a decision. The permissibility of such women, the permissibility of marriage for the children of the second marriage of a Reformed woman is grounded in a kind of, you might say, zealous anti-Reform position. Reformed marriages aren't valid at all, and that makes it more palatable to people who might usually resist lenient decisions. At the same time, the same kind of irony exists with regard to reception on the other side. Modern Orthodox Jews, who sometimes make fun of certain Haredi decisors on the grounds that they ignore scientific evidence and don't care what scholars have to say, embraced the decision of Rav Ovadia Yosef that Ethiopian Jews are descended from the tribe of Dan, even though no historian will endorse that position. Why? Because the result is desirable. Similar issues of Jewish identity arise with respect to conversion, and I don't have time to address that at all at this point. I will say one other thing about the ironies here, and that is that when Chaim Soloveitchik wrote a famous article indicating that the mimetic Jewish society, the one that followed traditions, has been in large measure overturned, especially in Haredi circles, by texts. This was endorsed by modern Orthodox Jews usually happily, because it meant that the Haredim were engaged in excessive stringency. But some of those same modern Orthodox Jews, when you deal with certain issues having to do with feminist innovation, are perfectly happy to treat mimetic tradition without too much concern. And so let me finish with by reading one paragraph, and let me read you two paragraphs. One comes from a responsible Rabbi Moses Feinstein, who permitted a certain woman to marry based on a letter he received from a rabbi in the Netherlands. And the rabbi wrote him back saying, maybe I presented this issue in a way that skews the result because this is such a wonderful young woman. Rabbi Feinstein responded as follows. As to your concern about your effort to permit this young woman, who is a precious, wholehearted soul, on the contrary, it is appropriate, decent, and desirable in the eyes of God to exercise effort on behalf of modest and precious women, just as we have been commanded to attempt to permit the marriage of agunot, provided that this effort is made in accordance with the laws of the Torah in truth, unquote. And now my final paragraph. There are no magic formulas for the balancing of humanitarian and ideological concerns on the one hand, and the straightforward meaning of texts on the other. For this task to be accomplished with integrity from the perspective of Orthodox Judaism, the decisor must genuinely believe in the authority of the Torah, in its divine origin, and in its eternal validity. In other words, what is nowadays described as the halachic process rests upon a foundation consisting of theology as well as legal analysis. It's not just that one who does not share the theological premises of Orthodox Judaism is excluded in principle as an authority. The legal arguments themselves become suspect because of the concern that they are unrestrained by the discipline of faith. That one pole of the dialectic between authoritative text and personal or communal need is deficient. Both elements of that dialectic have been essential to the dynamic of Jewish law. To undermine either of them is to distort not only halakha, but the history of halakha as well.
Take half a second for you, Moshe. If anybody's on the landing wants to come in and sit down, now's a good time to do it. Take half a second to do it.
Thank you for
I actually think it's better if you look there. Yeah. I thought we changed the acoustics. Try it. Wait. Actually, wait.
thank you for inviting me and us for this event. Given the shortness of time, I will introduce the bold argument, and then maybe we'll have time to refine it. The question, and I would address the question in the largest theoretical terms possible. I understood the question to be how innovation happens and when in Iraq. And if we take now halachists that we will consider as, in this term, orthodox, and by orthodox I mean the following, that their procedure of doing halakha would prohibit one move, which is to claim that the section of traditional canonical halachic text is unauthoritative for historical reasons or for other reasons. And by that we mean the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and maybe some canonical interpretations of it. So whoever allows himself to make an innovation in halakha that makes the following argument, that there are few text statements within this corpus who stop to be authoritative, either for a variety of reasons, is outside of our discussion for the purposes of this book. Therefore, if there will be an innovation halakha, it will be interpretive. By interpretive I mean, it will assume that the text is authoritative, and it will try to argue for the authority of the statement that the interpreter or the rabbi advancing by hooking it, by channeling it through interpretation. Now, we have to understand, therefore, the following. My first argument is innovation in halacha is done through the medium of interpretation. It's an interpretive path. Now, if we look at interpretation, and here I will make a distinction that seems to be central to interpretation halacha and legal interpretation in general. There are two types of arguments in interpretation. One has to do with pure semantics and philology. You confront the text is ambiguous, you can read it this way, that way, and you try to figure out the meaning through philological and semantic argument. But, and here is the area that I'm most interested, sometimes you adjudicate between interpretive options not through semantic arguments, but through value arguments. Meaning, you look at the text and you say, well, you can read ayin tachat ayin literally, eye for an eye. You can read it, though, by a stretch, you can read it to mean monetary compensation. I prefer X over Y, not because it's semantically preferable, but because it seems to be more just, more fair, more decent. Now, this is a question I've asked myself many years ago. And the question I want to raise is the following. To what degree is value argument, value considerations serve as an interpretive criterion in halacha, in which, through the integration of those values into interpretive process, halachic revolutions happen? That's the kind of question, I would say, hypothesis to examine. Let me give you an interesting example for it, which is actually a moment where I think a dramatic transformation of halacha happens. Right? This is a Gemara in Shabbat, Tractat Shabbat. It appears also in the Sifra and many other texts. And it says the following: Adava benidata, the menstruating woman, while she is nida, Skanim Arishonim Omrim. Skanim Arishonim means the traditional elders used to say, Shelo tikhol, shelo tifkos, shelo titkashet begadim tzivonim. She shouldn't wear makeup, she shouldn't dress herself in beautiful dress, because they read the term nida to mean what? Excommunicated, banned. By the way, that might be a good straightforward reading of the term nida, nidui. Now comes a very interesting moment in the history of halacha. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva ve'amar, till Rabbi Akiva came, and here, by the way, innovation is clear because Rabbi Akiva introduced the shift. ואמר, נמצאת המגנה על בעלה והוא מבקש לגרשה. If you impose on her this banishment, you will alienate her from her husband, and it will end up in divorce, especially Rabbi Akiva's arguments for divorce, but this is a different issue. Therefore, he introduces a new reading. והדבר בנידתה תהיה בנידתה עד שתבוא במים. He reads a different reading. I'm not going to enter now his reading, but he offers a different argument for how to read the text. So what's happening here? We have a traditional reading of Nida is Nidui. We have this was a hint of sorts. We have and now Rabbi Akiva, by the way, doesn't offer a counter-semantic reading to what Nida is. He doesn't say, you got it wrong, Nida is not Nidui. Nida is not excommunication. No, he says, if you read it this way, it has harsh, inhuman consequences. Therefore, I offer different reading of the verse. By the way, in this case it meant a whole transformation of the halachic status of the Nida. And we know in Parai, apropos Ethiopian halacha, we know the impact of that they treat Nida as a banned, excommunicated person. So what is it that I'm claiming? I'm saying the following. If you look carefully, and here I'll be precise and short as I can, and introducing my argument. If you look carefully into the history of halacha, you see something very interesting. The most important innovations in halacha happen when a value sensitivity emerges as an interpretive criteria, opting for a different semantic reading of the text. And usually, this is my experience, and here this is the bold argument, when an halachist tells you that he is constrained by the formal meaning of the text in terms of his operation, what he means by that is that the usual pressure of the value that you're addressing doesn't matter to him. He really doesn't care about this particular problem as a value pressure. Because the constraints of the interpretive process are not determined by the formal semantic boundaries of the text. They are determined by a very complex interaction between semantic options and value considerations of the interpreter. The last remark that I want to say, especially when it comes to moral issues. And many times halachists will say, well, look, there is nothing what can be done here. We have a straightforward text. And not only that, we have to learn to give up our conscience as a form of akedah, as an act of loyalty. But whenever, in moral cases, when you don't solve the problem, the one who sacrifices is not your conscience, is the other person. Right. And by the way, that's a big problem I found in Leibovitz and other people who argue for this model of akedah in halacha. The real victim of the akedah was not Abraham, who sacrificed in conscience. The real victim is Yitzchak. Because whenever you sacrifice your conscience, someone else is your victim. So the issue, I mean, this is really, within the short time, I wanted to introduce, first of all, the interpretive principle, and I wanted to introduce the distinction between two types of interpretive criteria that are used into the halachic process. And as far as I go, the most interesting moments, by the way, it happens in every page in the Talmud. It doesn't have to be that dramatic like the case of Nida. Whenever you meet an interpretive gap between the authoritative text and the legal interpretation that comes out of it, you have to examine the value consideration that operated in creating that interpretive gap. And this is why examining innovation in halacha many times is really not examining the textual constraints on the posek, but examining the sort of values and sensibilities it brings into the process.
Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be back here at Kesher Israel. It's a privilege to be a daily worshiper the years 92 to 93. And after leaving Kesher, I was reminded of the song sung by American soldiers returning from the First World War, namely, how can you keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? I did not return to Toronto, by the way. He said. I'm very happy that Professor Halbertal, a friend and colleague, raised the question of values. I think that the question of innovation in halakha is a question, is innovation a fact or a value? Now, the fact-value distinction is a basic distinction in modern social theory, especially brought up by the German sociologist Max Weber. And the question I'm raising is innovation halakha a fact or a value or an anti-value? Fact, a value, and anti-value. And let me cite the following example. When I was here in Washington at the Woodrow Wilson Center, I received a call from Professor Michael Walzer, who's Halbertal's been involved with, in his project, The Jewish Political Tradition. I did not know Michael Walzer personally. I knew of his great reputation, of course. This was a project which now there have been 2 volumes have appeared to bring classic texts from the Jewish tradition dealing with political issues that would not be known except by people who know the commentaries and the response and whatever, and commentaries by Jewish philosophers dealing with the ideas involved in these texts. And he asked me to write a sample response to one of these texts. The text was as follows. In 1920, the British Mandate government in Palestine proposed that there be to the Yishuv, to the Jewish community there, a Vad Umi, a national council. And the question was, could women, according to halakha, serve on this national council? And the question was asked of the 2 chief rabbis, Rabbi Avram Yitzchak Cook, who died in 1935, and the Sephardi chief rabbi, Rabbi Menzies Meir Chai Uziel, who died in 1953. The question was proposed to them, can, according to halakha, women serve on the Vad Umi? This is clearly an innovation. Now, how was it handled by these 2 rabbis? Well, not only chief rabbis, but both of them impressive poskim, halakhic decisors. For Rabbi Cook, despite all of the reputation of his being open-minded and receptive of secular Zionists and whatever, if you actually read most of his tshuvot, they're extremely conservative, small c. Rabbi Cook's argument was that this shouldn't be the case, and he cited the famous Talmudic text called Kvod HaMelech Pnima, that women should not be involved in public matters, and that this is a sign of the pursuit, of the breakdown of morality in the society, etc., etc., etc. So what clearly innovation, especially in this area for Rav Kook, was an anti-value. That is, he was opposed to innovation, supposedly in general, and in this case in particular. For Rav Uziel, the innovation is a fact, and the fact is such that Rav Uziel, following especially Sephardi patterns, which generally are, if something is not specifically prohibited, it is permitted, as distinct from certain poskim who something is prohibited until specifically permitted and is not permitted. We assume that it's not permitted unless specifically dispensed from obligation. Rabbi Uziel said, I don't see this as a problem. He said, don't tell me, Melech or Malka, that you can, in ancient times you couldn't have a queen but only a king, and whatever, and in certain religious offices it has to be men rather than women. This is not the issue at all. I don't see what the problem is. Now, what was happening is that both of them were in effect, I think, avoiding what the issue is. Rav Kook was making it an example of what he considered innovation to be an anti-value, and something which should be rejected simply as one more example to break down traditional patterns. Rav Uziel is treating innovation, which is clearly a fact of the changed status of women, especially politically, as if it were an ordinary she'elah, which it clearly is not. The interesting thing when I was reading this and analyzing it, whatever, came to mind that there was a third person who should have been asked. And the third person who shouldn't have been asked, and I understand why he wasn't asked, was the Rabbi HaKohen, Yisrael Meir HaKohen, the Chafetz Chaim, died in 1932. Obviously he wasn't asked because he wasn't a Zionist. But I think of the famous tshuva of the Chofetz Chaim on the question of the education of women in the Bet Yaakov schools, those Beis Yaakov schools. And this was considered a major innovation in the Orthodox world, that women were to be given a formal education. And in fact, to indicate this is the case, I just, before we began this evening, had a pleasant conversation with the old friend of mine, Baruch Weiss, whose father, Professor Berger Weiss Halibni, indicated that in his community of Sighet, that female members of his family were not allowed to go to the Beis Yaakov school. This was considered to be much too innovative in that Hasidic community. Now, the Chofetz Chaim in this case did not cite a minority opinion in the Mishnah, Ben Azai, that you're obligated to teach your daughter Torah, which is not the way. He simply gave an argument that recognized the fact of innovation, namely the changed status, the changed factual status of women. And his argument was basically that if women can get a secular education and we don't provide a Torah alternative for them, where do you think their outlook is going to be formulated? So therefore, it was an argument recognizing a radically changed fact and indicating that basically we had to almost adopt an Et Lasot Hashem. In other words, this is a situation that calls for innovation on our part, not just simply citing precedent, because what are the negative alternatives going to be if we just sit back and business as usual? Now, whether the Chofetz Chaim, even if he had even asked, would have given that opinion in terms of women serving on a national council by saying, well, after all, women can serve in secular bodies and parliaments and whatever, I don't know, I doubt it. But at least the approach that he gave there is innovation is not a value, nor an anti-value. Clearly, there are radically changed situations where you cannot simply rely on ordinary precedent, where in effect you have to, as it were, formulate new principles, or at least apply old principles in a somewhat radical way in order to save what I would call the normative continuity of the community. The problem with innovation as a value is this comes straight out of 19th century Hegelian philosophy, which was very much an influence on the reform movement, where it's not only innovation is something one has to do, but something one ought to do, to be in the vanguard of progress, to be in the vanguard of the kind of culmination of history. And that is what the Hastam Sofer was, I think, reacting to in terms of Chadash Asur Min HaTorah, that innovation in and of itself is prohibited by the Torah as a value. But the Hastam Sofer, and it goes with this point, the Hastam Sofer, despite the fact making that statement, and just as a footnote, the first place I discovered he made it was in a letter to Maratz Chayes, who was a rather innovative, at least thinker in his own right, in the 1820s already, in the early 1830s, excuse me. But the Hastam Sofer, if you read his Tshuvot, even though he had this general point that change is not, or innovation is not a value, if you read some of his Tshuvot, he was a tremendous mechadesh in halakha. He was a tremendous innovator in halakha for halachic problems that were facing normative Jews. I think of his changed definition of the definition of death. The halachic definition of death, recognizing clearly what he considered to be new scientific evidence. But there again, it was a response to a fact, not innovation being either a value or an anti-value. And I think that approach is a healthy approach, which would serve us well today.
I'm going to ask one question to each of our panelists, and if the responses, which I think are brief, everybody else. I'm going to go in reverse order. So David Novak, what you seem to be saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that really innovation in halakha is a response to a reality that is Western. So it's sort of, if we really could sort of live in whatever ancient reality, or maybe even 20-year ago reality, we really wouldn't have to. You see any place, maybe I'm reading incorrectly, but even in your presentation of the three people that you spoke about in terms of the question of women being on the councils, Rav Uziel is the one who's really not talking about it as something that's been thrust upon him, as you said, and you seem to say, well, he really should have seen it that way. Do you see any place for the halachists to sit down and anticipate, or to think ahead, or to see something that might be positive, and to create a new structure? Or is it really basically, when something is thrust upon us, when we have to react, and then we need to sort of find a way with the halacha to provide continuity on it?
That question is precisely the question, Mutaz Mutaz, that is asked in the context of, we're here in Washington, the Supreme Court. Is the Supreme Court supposed to adjudicate, or is the Supreme Court supposed to legislate? Now, in other words, therefore, adjudication is generally retrospective. A case comes before, and one has to decide what ought to be done. One doesn't go looking for the case, so to speak. The case comes to one. Whereas legislators are supposed to be prospective, in other words, kind of looking ahead and making laws. But even Maimonides, who has the most prospective notion of halakha, where he says that the whole Torah Shebaal Peh, the whole oral Torah, is basically the creation of the Beit Din HaGadol, nonetheless, of the Sanhedrin, the great court, still, if you read carefully what he says in the first chapter of Hilchot Mamrim, he says that they only innovated when cases came before them for which there was no precedent, and therefore they had to rule. So even there, it was not kind of making law for the future, but still a responsive approach, which had to be innovative because simply one couldn't deduce the answer from a precedent. So I'm very suspicious of people and who seem to want to be, in effect, making rules when nobody's asked a question about a case where the rule needs to be applied. And precisely one sees this in certain aspects, especially of Haredi halakha, where in effect all kinds of takanot and all kinds of enactments are made because of anticipating, something that might happen, or in attempting to undo what they consider to be a gross deviation from a pristine past.
Moshe Halbertal, the concern that I think your formulation raises is the question of whether, within this interpretive or reinterpretive way of looking at things, are there no limits? Does the text have no end to it? To take your specific example of Nudah, could Rabbi Akiva have somehow interpreted Nudah in such a way that would have removed the prohibition of having marital relations with Nudah? Which, again, is fairly clear, because I think, as you said correctly, Nudah is excommunication, being different is Nudah as it appears in other kind of contexts.
Well, I would say, sure, there are constraints, but constraints are not textual. You ask me, is there a way, do we find a place in the interpretive tradition of Yahudut that more interesting, radical interpretive moves are made? Sure. Almost every page you turn, you see such bold, speculative, interpretive moves. The constraint comes from somewhere else. It comes, first of all, from loyalty to a living tradition, which is very powerful. It comes from a sense of Avodat Hashem, which is very deep. And it comes from value considerations. There is a possibility, interpretively, to read Lo Tirtzach as Lo Tirtzach. This is completely far-fetched, but every time I read 13 Gimel Midot HaRachamim, you read Hashem Hashem En Rachum Lechanun En Chapayim Al Chesed Ve'emet Yotzer Chesed La'anachim Nose Avon V'Pesha V'Chata'a V'Nakeh. Okay, nice. Okay, but it's really says Nakeh Lo Yenakeh. Every time I read that, I say, wow. Now, is this interpretably bolder or moderate than reading Lo Tirtzach? No. But what constrains the reading of Lo Tirtzach is not the structural semantic force of the composition of the sentence. It's just the fact that you don't want to allow murder. So I want to refer, by the way, to the example that was raised here about Rav Kook and voting for women, or women being elected. Rav Kook, as David mentioned already, Rav Kook was a big supporter of the Kerem Kfira, of the fiction, basically undermining all prohibitions of the sabbatical year. Now, there's debate whether it's the Oraita or the Rabbanan, but as far as the legal mechanism used, it is so speculative to sell the land to the Goy in order to overcome a whole set of prohibitions that might be the Oraita. So you say, well, but when it came to women, he was conservative. You know, you say, well, I mean, there is a very simple argument. Rav Uziel says, not only Rav Uziel says, in democratic structures, being elected is not a position of authority, it's a position of representation. And women can represent you. They're not allowed to be queens, but a prime minister is not a queen. By the way, some rabbis said about it at Golda. Meir, Zichronah Libracha. He didn't have the mechanism. I mean, he was constrained by the text Melech velo Malka. I mean, if he was constrained by that, wouldn't he be constrained by Lo Techonem, that you shouldn't sell the land to a goy? He shouldn't be constrained by V'shavta Haaretz, etc., etc. Well, in reality, Rav Kook's, from his own sensibilities, when you read him, women's equality was something he not only didn't care about, he was against. He had a patriarchal conception of the organic unity of the family. You read him, he says a family should be led by the father. If you will allow women votes, there would be political arguments in the family would be distracted, etc. By the way, in that respect, he talked the language of the early romantics of Europe in the 20th century about the family. He was Hegelian in that respect. So my issue is the following. And by the way, I'm looking now at the history of Halacha, in contemporary Halacha. I'm being in Israel, and the concerns there are completely different. It's not about mechitzas and other things. We have, the government raises, today, it voted that citizens, that non-Jewish citizens, in order to become a citizen, you have to give an oath to the country as a Jewish democratic state. It doesn't apply to Jews. All of Shas voted for it. I asked myself, where is the halachis? They are in uproar about, they put out 200,000 people in the streets about a school of Beis Yaakov in Emmanuel. The truth is, this is not something that they care. You say it's a discrimination, no? Isn't it a discrimination? I mean, can't you quote a verse against it? Kager, Ka'ezrach, the whole thing. Are you constrained semantically to discriminate in this case? No. Well, the issue is that they weren't exposed, their education in that respect. Whatever they were exposed was people, as human beings. Their education vis-a-vis the modern values of political reality weren't only extremely dietetic. They were in conditions of how do you say that when people don't eat anything and they become very thin.
Anorexic.
Yeah, exactly. They were in a condition of anorexia in terms of exposure to those issues. Now you would say the whole structure of halacha will collapse if Rabbi Ovadia would say this is asur from the Torah. Well, the whole structure of halacha didn't collapse when you were allowed to loan and borrow with interest, though it's an isur deoraita. And you have a very interesting fiction all the time, because you care about those issues. So the constraints are not, whenever an halachist tell you that he's constrained by the semantic structure of the burden of tradition, he's not honest about what he's doing. He is constrained. I'm not saying that he will do anything he wants. And you know, to read the Torah without a trope, this is really this is your chidush. I mean, this is not Hashem Shamayim in the deepest sense, right? But we're talking about serious issues, really, serious human issues, concerns about marriage and conversion and the status of non-Jews, etc. The halakha is in a horrible state. Okay, I think I've
My question to David Berger. I agree with you that much innovation, many of the examples were pretty modern, but would you comment on where I started, which is the impact of reform, fear of reforms, and all the rest, in the process of the ability to innovate, from within certain kinds of more modern ways of doing things?
I don't think that the halacha, and a friend of mine is upset about the use of the term halacha as a substitute for what our ancestors would have called Torah. He speaks of a reification of halacha. In this case, we actually are talking about Torah. I don't think the condition of halacha is quite as terrible a condition as we've just heard, and maybe that means that I don't care enough about the values that you care about. Let me
I don't believe it.
When I say something about this, I do not produce victims because I have no authority. You notice that he said Baruch Hashem, and I do say that. I actually tried to anticipate that a little bit by giving some examples of halakhic innovation in our own time. Once a halakhic innovation happens, I think that what sometimes happens is that it's put in the bank, but without any credit given. That's behind us. So now let's talk about halakhic innovation, and let's see all the things that people aren't doing. Well, the things they did do somehow are not recognized. So let me kind of mention some of those things again. Maybe I'll mention something additional. There have been very significant innovations on a technological level. There have been some innovations on some of these humanitarian issues. There is, and once again, people will say that it's not enough, and if you really cared about this, there would be more. But prenuptial agreement has been introduced with the endorsement of the Rabbinical Council of America, usually associated with the name of Rabbi Mordechai Willett, which has become close to required in many modern Orthodox circles. It's required here. And that is a significant move, and there is opposition to it. And opposition that has been ignored by its proponents, despite the fact say, and I'm talking about a very distinguished opponent, that the second marriage of a woman who has a divorce in the context of an earlier prenuptial agreement is not really divorced, and that her second marriage is adulterous, and that the child is not legitimate. You could imagine such things being said, and they have been set aside. That's an innovation. So of course you can find texts going back hundreds of years with such a prenuptial agreement, but that's a significant innovation. There certainly have been innovations with regard to other to keep to this women's issue matter. But mitzvah has been put in the bank long ago. So that doesn't count. I don't know how many decades have to pass before we say, don't mention such things. That happened in the Middle Ages. And here things are very complicated. And here Professor Halbertal has written the most important study of Rabbi Menachem Hameiri, and that involves would be a revolution if his position had been universally affirmed, but it's a revolution with a small r, which was driven by values. I don't think there's any question about that. And when you ask what is the attitude toward the halakhic status of non-Jews today, and setting aside, I don't know if I want to pursue this, the question of Christianity and where it stands. I think that it's fair to say that the number of rabbinic figures and the number of Jews who effectively accept the tolerant and almost embracing position of Rabbi Menachem Hameiri of medieval Provençal halachists is much greater than it was 200 years ago. Is, I think, even greater than it was 100 years ago. Although there is, in this case, a kind of opposite force, which most recently surfaced in that horrific book that was investigation of rabbinic figures by the Israeli government. I'm not happy about that investigation, but I'm even less happy about it. That's a case where I don't want to discuss a half full glass without discussing the half empty part of it. But it's not the case that halachists are frozen into immobility out of fear of conservative and reform Judaism. Although there is an element of that.
We've heard, I think, three very interesting positions, and probably lots of questions.
So it seems to me that this discussion now leads to not just if we should have innovations, but who decides. And none of you guys have really, I mean, you've gotten onto the border of that, but haven't, Moshe probably gone the furthest. And as Dr. Novak, as you mentioned, the Supreme Court, we've just gone through these, for 2 years, we've just gone through this confirmation process of where we decide who decides, and the kind of incredible, outrageous concerns that we had about some of these people who decide who they decide. And Moshe, you mentioned some constraints, but you didn't mention, which I think is kind of the one that's been most pressing, at least here in the United States, which is peer pressure, political pressure. Rabbis are afraid to go out too far because their colleagues will dismiss them. So who do we pick? How do we decide who decides? And Rabbi Berger, you say you have no authority. You're the only one on the stage there that's preparing every Orthodox rabbi in this country. So you probably have the most authority of anyone. And then there's one other level to the question, which is, are there different criteria for who decides in Israel? And does that have influence on us? The decisions that we make here, does that have influence on them? And what about the rabbinic authority in England wants to make a decision. Where did that fit in?
As I take it, you were asking all three.
I was asking all three.
Right. Okay. So halacha in terms of halacha, the structure of halachic authority doesn't have what Hart used to call rules of recognition. Right? There's no way of nominating in an orderly political procedure who makes the rule. And I must say, when it comes to goyim, really serious people, I don't think peer pressure is a function. I'm talking about really the first rank, and they're not elected. They are there because they have tremendous learning, and they embody in their own lives the values of the community. And they are recognized for their greatness along those aspects. So they become who they become.
And therefore not influenced by what other people might say about what they decide?
I don't think that, I don't think that Moshe Halbertal or Rabbi are influenced by peer groups. They are influenced by, by the peers, they are influenced by, they haven't imagined, דמות דיוקנו של אביו נבנתה לו בחלום. They stand for a tradition that they are responsible for. And their power to impact change is immensely, and they do it on a daily basis on things that we don't think they are important. But for example, today there is an immense change in dietary in kashrut because of the microscopic ability to see worms. No, seriously. If you would, figs are not being eaten. My grandmother's only ate figs. So there are things that are happening. I don't think it's a pressure group, and I don't think it's I think it's the constraints, as I said. I think it's the makeup of the worldview and the range of exposure and concerns that the Posek has operating in the world in which he operates.
Yeah, I'd like to, Moshe, I'd like to take issue with that. We both referred to whom I think, in many ways, was the greatest posek of the 20th century, Ben Metzia and Berger Uziel. And in 1937, an answer from a question from a rabbi in Bombay, whether Jews on Shabbat to go to the synagogue were allowed to ride in a tram car. I don't know if there's an error, but listen, it wasn't an error. The ticket was sewn into their clothes or whatever. And he writes a tshuva indicating that this is permissible. In the second version of the tshuva, written I believe in 1947, he gives an answer of whoever is zealous for the Lord will not do this. Very clearly, pressure was placed upon him, where he rescinded what he considered. In fact, there was also a rabbi many years ago here in Washington, Orthodox rabbi, who also gave it. And here again, you have a rabbi. I'm not telling people it's not. I'm not giving a halakhic header for it, but I'm just indicating this is the case. And when you have the question, for example, of the Ribosh, Yitzhak Bar Sheshet Parfat, who, on the question of marriage, when we talk about marriage, much more radical, the question of marriage annulment, Afka'at Kedushin, said that he would be in favor of it, but he will not endorse this practice unless he has the agreement of the other Spanish rabbis. This is too great an innovation for him to do unilaterally, and apparently he never got that agreement or whatever. So, I think that the question of peer pressure in the sense of one's colleagues other rabbis, and even understanding of what the population will accept and what they won't accept does play a factor. Now, it's a necessary but not sufficient condition. I mean, the sufficient condition is ultimately whether you can make what you consider to be a valid halakhic argument. But certainly, these are conditions that have to be taken, into consideration, and indeed in the formulation of a halakha. Both what other rabbis thought and whether you thought something could actually pass muster popularly is discussed in the Talmud. But it's a necessary, not sufficient condition.
But what about the bigger question, which is how do we know? How do we know who it's for?
I'm going to try to respond to that. As Moshe said, it's difficult to respond to that because there aren't any rules of recognition. I want to say one sentence first that I left out before about the stuff that's been put in the bank, and that's advanced Torah study for women. So now I'll turn to this. There aren't rules of recognition. And therefore what happens is that certain communities, and within Orthodoxy there's an interesting dynamic here, and that is that the decisors of the Haredi world, there's no good English word for that, so we started to say Haredi. Not so long ago, meaning 2 generations ago, Haredi meant Orthodox. When people wrote Hebrew in America, they wrote Haredi as the word for Orthodox, but traditionalist Orthodox is what I usually say. Well, I once got a call from, or an email, it was an email from Yitzhak Aberstein, who was a rabbi in Los Angeles, who has 1 foot in the modern Orthodox world and 1 foot in the traditionalist Orthodox world. He asked me, what should you call ultra-Orthodox Jews? He's having a discussion with the Los Angeles Times. And ultra-Orthodox has a pejorative tone, which it does, and fervent Orthodox, which they were starting to use, is kind of an insult to the modern Orthodox. So I made a variety of suggestions, not seriously. I said, well, I can give you some that are good for the Haredim, the genuinely Orthodox, the serious Orthodox, learned Orthodox, and I can give you some on the other side, the intolerant Orthodox, the insular Orthodox, and my favorite one is the proud of their secular education but opposed to it Orthodox. However, I use traditionalists, but in any case, the authorities of the traditionalist Orthodox community tend to be regarded as authorities, not ultimate authorities, but as serious authorities by modern Orthodox Jews, by serious modern Orthodox Jews. So that modern Orthodox Jews will not be dismissive of a position of Rabbi Yoshi. They might not accept it, but they will not be dismissive of it. They will not be dismissive of a position of Rabbi Vadia Yosef. On the other hand, within the modern Orthodox community, in part because I think modern Orthodox Jews value autonomy more, they do not accept the most expansive understanding of the term Das Torah, or the opinion of the Torah. They tend to be much more jealous of their own opinions, and therefore it's much harder to get modern Orthodox Jews to recognize authority of a halakhic sort. And there is a critical stance toward rabbinic authorities even within the modern Orthodox community. I don't want to name names, but I personally react with reservations about certain modern Orthodox figure or figures because I don't like certain things they've said, and I'm prepared to say that my not liking it matters. Years ago, when the Doling cards came out, the baseball cards, there was a New York Times story about the Doling cards and how they were being traded. So the Purim issue, one of the New York College newspapers, which that year had some terrifically good editors, because there were 2 jokes in that Purim issue that are for the ages. One, which is not the one relevant here, this was the centennial of Yeshiva University, which was celebrated for about 3 years, based on the founding of Yeshivat Eitz Chaim in the 1880s. They put in an ad, as it were, from the Satmar Rav, which said, congratulations to Yeshiva University on its centennial, Ad Mei Aviesi. In the same issue, there was an ad for modern Orthodox Gedolim cars. It said, collect both cars. And so, the answer to that, I think that is the answer to that there is much less of an authority structure in view than there is in the traditional Slovak community. But there is a sense that an innovation that involves what is seen as fundamental change needs to be endorsed by some sort of critical mass of major rabbis, people whom you would go to with serious questions in other fields, so that to take the explosive issues of the last year, if the question of whether a woman will be called a Rabbi, or if a woman will lead the Kabbalah Shabbos as a chazan, is the sort of thing, and this is the sense of most of the modern Orthodox rabbinate, and I think lay community at this point, that one doesn't do without some sort of critical mass of rabbinic opinion on the highest level.
I have two observations and one question that is worth to. My first observation is that listening to this very, very, very dramatically distinguished panel, I have a very dramatic perception of the difference, okay, from the rabbis living in the American continent and from the rabbis living in Israel. My impression is that the rabbi that lives in Israel is conditioned by the immediacy of the situation. You, Rabbi Halbertal, has not talked about many of the theoretical things, and when you talked about the present halachic issue, have talked about what are we as Jews, what do we believe, is that in the tradition of our Ahavat Hashem to discriminate or not to discriminate. That's one observation. The second observation is a personal thing. About 45 years ago, I was the only Orthodox Jew teaching in a Catholic Jesuit university in Buenos Aires. And they thought since I was a Jew, I had to know about philosophy. I was teaching something totally different. And this was the Jesuits were involved in serious problems about liberation theology. And Jews ought to know about that because they are never liberated. So. There was a discussion, could they depart from the teachings of the church, and could they go a different sort? And what was innovation? And the issue came up, who makes the decisions? And of course there were different views according to the different people. Someone that were referring to Rome and the concealing of the faith, very distinguished group, and others that talked about values, talked about anti-values, talked about how could they be concerned about the minutiae of their religion when people were being murdered and killed and all kinds of things. So maybe the perspective is that innovation occurs always. In my discipline and the section between biology and other things, innovation is a fact. It cannot be changed. innovation is for good or for bad. When I married over half a century ago, the Rabbonim at my wedding were very happy that I danced with a Jewish woman, and because there were not many Jewish marriages occurring. Now I cannot sit at the wedding with my wife, but that's a different story. But my question is this, and you have touched on it very, very. What is the meaning of many of those issues that because we do not innovate, still does, as in our observance and in our faith? And I give some examples. I have never in my life built a tent. I am not disposed to it. I was not a Boy Scout. I was a Shiva group. So I never built a tent. But if it rains and I come to the shul with an umbrella, I build a tent. Okay, that to me makes no sense. The issues about halakha, about electricity, and so on, are getting more and more difficult because you travel, and we travel a lot. In a hotel, I have always to go to the second floor, or if they put me on a higher floor, I always have to run around with someone that will put the little thing into the door so that the door opens. I have talked that with people that I respect, and there is peer pressure. Since there is a question on just the passage of electrons is fire, but maybe there will be another. The third issue is in Israel, the issue of the selling of the land, and in America, the selling of the homes, the figment of imagination, that it's not ours, which is difficult to understand. Now, is modernity compatible with that? Is innovation going to catch up with it? We do not have a Sanhedrin. How are we going to happen?
Well, I mean, we've touched on it before. I mean, the innovation, or when you need what seems to be a radical halakhic ruling. I mean, even though when a shuvah is written, at least in principle, if I say that something is prohibited or something is permitted, I am in effect saying that I think that any Jew, irrespective of label or whatever, in this position ought to do A or B. That's in principle. In fact, I am doing this for members of a community that look to me or whoever else to solve some of their problems. And to a large extent, I mean, Moshe Halbertal referred to this. If my community doesn't consider this to be a problem, I'm not going to deal with it. Simply because, you know, it's like the old joke about the yeshiva Berger, you know, I have an answer, ask me a question. It's supposed to be, ask me a question, and then I'll supply an answer. It's supposed to be responsive, not, innovative. So, I mean, in that way, this is the case. But ultimately, the question that was also raised, in other words, who's authorized to make these decisions? When I first came to Washington in the 1960s to study philosophy at Georgetown University, my mentor is probably one of the most distinguished Catholic moralists in the world. He wrote a book of 900 of his responsa. 900 of his responsa. And he opens the volume as follows. Because he's a layman, and usually only priests answer these questions. So he said he once gave a talk, and a certain nun screamed at him, "Who are you to tell people what to do? Who are you to tell what people do?" And his answer was, "Because they asked me." And that ultimately is. Somebody became a posek because enough people asked this person. They thought this person knew something. They thought this person had model character, and they asked the question. And if you don't agree with that person, there are two ways you can do it. You can either ignore them, you can either disagree with the person on rant for what they said, or you can dismiss the person as somebody who's irrelevant and outside the tradition and whatever. That's what you can do.
Something very quick about the two Shabbos examples. First, Chametz and Piras, the land of Israel, we sort of touched on already before. They are obviously very problematic and very. But the two Shabbos examples, the umbrella, the door. So we're dealing with technical details that emerge out of a larger structure. First of all, it's true in any legal system that you reach cases, liminal cases where you have to decide on what side of the line it goes. Unless I'm not up to date, creches on public property are forbidden unless there's a reindeer there, which makes it secular. So that that kind of thing. So and Shabbos works, in my opinion. This is not halakhic judgment. This is a personal psychological judgment. Shabbos works because of these details. If Shabbos were to be defined by some sort of sense of resting and not going to your regular job, the impact of Shabbos would be destroyed. You would take that emergency phone call. Well, it might be an emergency phone call. An emergency means not when somebody's life is at stake, but when your business is, a little bit in danger. So wherever you come down on these specific issues, the existence of such questions is integral to that which makes Shabbos work.
I have, concerning the question of electricity, halachists had a lot of difficulties finding a precedent for prohibiting electricity, Novak and all the discussion with the Moshe. But I think they got it. I think there was one of the most important decisions of modern halakha is to prohibit electricity in Shabbat, because they understood that all industrial operations, all modern creativity, all transformation of the world will be through electricity. And if Shabbat is a day in which you don't change the world, you have to prohibit electricity. And I think there is some very deep point to it in terms of the history of halakha, though it was very difficult for them, and they were perplexed, to find a proper category in which to hook this thing into the traditional prohibitions of Shabbos. But I think there's something deep and important in that whole thing. I just want to say something about the issue of that David Berger raised concerning the issue of women and Kabbalat Shabbat and this issue. And you're right, there is a need for, and my response about peer pressure is not that rabbis are not seeking consensus. I'm speaking about just sheer fear of what people will say about them, etc., etc. I mean, serious people shouldn't be concerned about that. Rivash says, I have to share this responsibility. It's not, I think, what you meant. But when you ask yourself, you say, well, there is a need for a really mass rabbinic authority to introduce such a check. You have to ask yourself another question. Maybe. Feminism is the most important moral revolution that maybe happened in the human history altogether. And it touches all aspects of life. It was non-violent, and yet it's I think from all political human events, that's the most dramatic. Now, when you're going to ask a posek about Kabbalat Shabbat, And he will answer you this, that. I mean, it's not clear that there are halachic ways in which you can reject that. You ask yourself, why should there be an issue altogether? But you have to ask yourself another question. Does he share and celebrate that deep moral political revolution that happened in the world? Or not? Where does he stand as a human, as a sensitive human being in the world? What is this attitude towards that what had happened? By the way, that has many, and I would say that has many, like many great things that happen, many unintended bad consequences on many levels. But this is the real question. So it will be strange for a community that shares and embraces that transformation in a serious way on an everyday life of education, of family structure, of other things, to submit in that respect to authorities who are not, by the way, basing themselves on this or that text. They're basing themselves on a general sensibility of rejecting the whole thing as an important human event. And this is, I'm not a rabbi. I had a smicha, but I've never practiced as a rabbi because for different reasons. But, and I'm not going to offer now the technicalities about how you go about this issue, but we have to raise this issue in principle. This is not an issue you can avoid. I mean, there is a dramatic transformation in our world. And before you're going to ask yourself how you deal with that or this issue, you'll have to ask yourself a more basic question: do I embrace it or not? And I would say most of those people who kind of fight about that is a real problem. I mean, what's the real problem? Basically, underlying clear there are some sensibilities of aesthetics of ritual. I'm not used to it. It's strange. I mean, this is serious stuff. I'm not. But many of them say, look, it's a symbol for something deeper that is going on, which I feel either against or ambivalent about. Either against or ambivalent. And then you find yourself in a very interesting situation in which the one who brings the question and the one who answers the question do not share a worldview about a serious problem in human life. By the way, from the point of view of technical halacha, absolutely marginal. But it becomes fetishized because it's a marker of this deep-seated relationship to something dramatic that happens in the world around us.
I would just say that since I oppose them, I don't see myself in the same terms. I think there are serious halachic issues, and I think I share the values at all levels.
Okay, by the way, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine.
subject to criticism, but they're hardly defensible, is based for some people not on a lack of sympathy for women's equality in society, and not the lack of respect for women's ability, and all the other things that go into certain forms of anti-feminism, but concerns about certain bedrock distinctions between men and women in Jewish law, which, in light of your earlier presentation, you might say are just as subject to elimination if somebody genuinely cares about them, as everything else, or virtually everything else in Jewish law. But I think you will agree that the constraints against women serving as witnesses in certain contexts, the constraints against women fulfilling obligations on behalf of men in certain contexts are pretty embedded in the fundamental strata of halacha. And the way I have put this, and I'll end with this is obviously a whole discussion that could last for a very long time, is that people who are opposed, I know you have something on this, is that people who are not willing to oppose innovations of this sort because of the slippery slope, which is an issue that was raised with respect to studying Torah, Torah Shabbat Peh, and with respect to a number of other things that have been embraced for the most part in the modern Orthodox movement here, and in certain segments of Israeli Orthodoxy as well. People who did not say we won't do this because of the slippery slope start getting nervous when you're talking about something that they regard as itself being three-quarters of the way down the slope.
Last question.
We are right there.
Oh, okay. I just wanted to ask Moshe Halbertal a question. Your distinction between textual reasons for halakhic change and value consideration, is that the same as a distinction between internal causes of halakhic change and external ones? In other words, are some of the value considerations that you're talking about actually already internal to the halakhic tradition, so that it's permeated in some ways by ethical concepts that assume that kind of force? Or if it's not, if it's an external cause, then are you implying that people who are interested in halakhic development and halakhic change and halakhic evolution shouldn't work in the realm of halakha, as it were, but in the realm of ethics and culture and education, to, as it were, prepare the ground, that halakha can then retroactively meet itself?
That's a very deep and important question. I myself don't think that the distinction between internal and external is stable.
It's not stable.
It's not stable.
Right.
So, you take the most dramatic halachic text of Maimonides, as far as I know, chapter 11 of the Chot Avodah Zarah. Right? If you read it thoroughly, it's basically claiming that it's halachically prohibited to do anything which is non-rational. Our life, if we would follow that, our life would be dramatically different. That includes even living in a home that the elevator doesn't have 13. Okay? This is Isur min HaTorah. Now you ask yourself, according to Maimonides, the one who built it, the one who made his life, etc. Now you ask yourself, is this external or internal? Well, I mean, it clearly is nourished by his own understanding of what are the roots of idolatry and the connection between idolatry and irrationality or superstition. So you would say, did he learn it from Aristotle, from Torah? Well, actually what's fascinating is many times when value criterion is evoked as an interpretive adjudicator, is usually by referring to another text within the tradition. Right? And there is what Gadamer will call a hermeneutical cycle. So my view will be that the idea of we have to examine philosophically seriously whether we do have altogether this kind of strict distinction between the external and the internal.
Just for a second, I wrote an article called something that Judaism and the modern egalitarian ethos, some tentative thoughts among the Orthodox foreigners, where I dealt with an Erie and cited Moshe's book with great respect a number of times without even disagreeing with it. But this was a religious work more than a scholarly one, I tried to come to grips with some disturbing texts about non-Jews. I wrote there, and I have to say that this is a matter of an internal struggle of my own. I wrote that I think that we are permitted to re-examine certain texts based on what we believe to be the deepest values of the Torah. And I asked myself, is this a completely honest statement? What is it that makes me say that these are the deepest values of the Torah? Is it an objective reading of text, or is it certain ethical sensibilities that I have picked up, at least in part, from certain modern ethical sources? And I have to say that an honest answer is probably that it's both.
I just want to maybe make another point concerning and since you understood, we have to mention Ramban asked a certain question about this parasha. The 7 Noahide commandments were given after the flood. And he asks, how can people be punished with no commandments? And he says, Hamas, the theft, mitzvah muskelet. It's a reasoned commandment and rational commandment. שאין צורך לנביא להסביר עליה. There's no need for a prophet to tell you that this is wrong. So God, I mean, this is religiously affirming the moral conscience of humanity. So I would say to David, in that respect, while he's struggling with this issue, that it is internal to take seriously those moral convictions that you have. It is internal. Though their source might be from there or here or there, who knows?
You're saying that it's internal and universal.
Exactly. Yeah. This is what Nachmanides is saying, actually, is saying that religiously, not from the point of view of other moral world, you have to take seriously, religiously, those concerns that you have. So here the internal and external get even more complex, because maybe there is from the point of view of a tradition, you have to take seriously those so-called external moments in your life.
Freundel was Lichtenstein's famous article where he argued.
I'm going to ask David Novak if he wants to say a couple of last.
So I mean, the internal and external. I mean, I agree that all these great issues arise internally. There are 2 external criteria, though, that come in. Number one, the external criteria of application. In other words, we can deal with a certain problem in halakha and realize that there are going to be moral criteria that we regard as internal to the Torah, even if they're universal, but it happens to be the universal and the particular. And find, if not validation, the confirmation of that outside. The best example is the Maimonides, who very emphasized teleology, that everything is done for a purpose, did not learn that from Aristotle. It's in the Talmud, it's Ravos, the Torah Taima, the notion that we decide things by their rationale. His reading of Aristotle gave a confirmation that this is something that was recognized by people in other traditions and was helpful for our internal understanding. Where the external criterion applies is that even, I think, Moshe Halbertal used this, I hate to mention this name, Heideggerian term in der Weltsein, something's in the world. But the fact is that no matter how insulated the Jewish community is, it is still functioning within a larger world, and undoubtedly there are factors of that larger world that are going to require that be taken into consideration even when making a decision internally, or else you're living with blinders. And in that sense, I mean, this becomes the feminist question. The feminist question should be raised in terms of internally the Jewish tradition. There are precedents for people asking these questions about the different roles of men and women, and then realizing that undoubtedly this is a problem that concerns all human beings. And it would be strange if it didn't.
I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all of you. I just want to say two sentences. This last part of the conversation in particular, but really the entire conversation, takes me back at least to where we started framing this way back on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. I think there was a time in which the sense of overarching authority, as opposed to my internal autonomous feelings, were far better balanced than they are in where we are today. And I think that what has happened as the society has put so much more emphasis on autonomous decision making, on the ability for people to make their own choices, as choices have expanded, as people have been able to create their own communities through all various internet ways of doing so. These kinds of questions, right, is it internal, is it external? These kind of questions of, well, we have values that I think are important that have come from wherever, and how do I play them through my religious tradition? And where do they play within authorities? It becomes so much more critical. And I think that's really the issue. In so many ways, you gentlemen sort of expressed that, that's my formulation for it. In so many ways, what we're trying to investigate throughout this year is really the manifestation of those kind of questions, of these values that are so important to Western society, to us as Western people, as they play out through our Orthodox tradition, and through this synagogue as a representative modern Orthodox congregation in its 100th year, trying to face a future of the next 100 years, trying to figure out how to do that well. Thank you for being here. Yeah, at least. Thank you. Thank you very much for being here.